Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Joe Ruffalo. I am SVP and GM of The Hill, and want to thank you all for joining us in person and online this morning for this very important discussion on keeping pharmacy shelves filled, solutions to address drug shortages. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Healthcare Distribution Alliance, for their support of this very important topic this morning. In the first quarter of this year, there were a record 323 drug shortages in the United States. Shortages of life-saving cancer drugs, generics, and ADHD medications have dominated the headlines. Overall problems stem from demand exceeding supply, as well as manufacturing production challenges, especially in the generics market. Today, we are here to discuss meaningful solutions. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping rules. Please silence your phone if you're in the room. Also, please follow us online. You can follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at The Hill Events using the hashtag HillHealth. Also, if you're in the room, please be mindful of the cameras if you're walking across so people can watch at home. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our first guest, Congressman Larry Bucshon, a Republican from the great state and my home state of Indiana, a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and vice chairman of the Health Subcommittee. Before coming to Congress, Congressman Bucshon was a physician and surgeon, and he joins Kathleen Koch, contributing editor of The Hill, to begin today's program. Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Congressman, for joining us, or should I say, Dr. Bucshon.
Yeah, I always tell people, call me doctor, not congressman, because doctors are a lot more popular than congressmen. It's a true story.
They're more popular than journalists as well.
Yeah, well, what can I say?
So, Dr. Bucshon?
Yeah.
How frustrating is it as a medical professional to see where we are right now with these drug shortages? And I can't imagine the stories that you must be hearing right now from friends, even family. I mean, your wife is an anesthesiologist.
That's correct. Yeah, it's very frustrating, and it's a frustrating problem for the patients, of course. And so, for example, when we had a manufacturing facility shut down in India for carboplatin, which is a chemotherapeutic agent, a number of years ago, I have an oncology friend back in Indiana who called me and said, Larry, you need to can you come talk to me, because I'm actively having to ration carboplatin for my patients who are getting chemo as we speak because they were short on the drug. So that's, I hear firsthand from physicians. And then my wife, as an anesthesiologist, will tell me frequently that they have shortages of certain things called paralytic agents, which is one of the things she uses when they put people to sleep for surgery. And
what do they do about that?
Yeah, you have to try to find alternatives, and sometimes it's difficult. So this is a critical issue. Honestly, I've known about it since I started practicing medicine, 25, 30 years ago. So.
But it's gotten worse.
It has gotten worse. If you look at the numbers, it's 300 and some. I can't remember the exact number now, whereas 20 years ago, it was maybe 40, 50 drugs that are routinely short. Now they're mid-300s almost daily, that there are shortages worldwide.
Let's talk about just shortages in general. And I know that you understand that there are different types, but I think it's important that we describe the difference, because we have the disruptions that occur because of a sudden shock, say a health emergency or a tornado or a hurricane, the level of plant. Then we have the ones because of unexpected demand. The type that we're seeing, say, with the ADHD medications, right. the weight loss drugs, Wegovy, Zepbound. And then there are the shortages that make up the majority. So 83% of the shortages are generally due to manufacturing production issues, primarily quality issues, and they affect largely generic drugs. So which ones are you most worried about? Which type of shortage?
Well, all of them, but the one that is related to the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, is really critical for the United States, because actually it's starting to go into the national security space a little bit. And what that API is, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, maybe 20%, at the most 25% of those are actually produced in the United States. The rest were dependent on production from around the world. And we saw during the pandemic how that can be problematic. So I'm concerned about that, particularly a lot of the manufacturing that happens in China, because of the tension that we have from geopolitically with the Chinese, and they have threatened sometimes to withhold APIs. But it's it's just such a multifactorial problem. But I think one of the big ones that I'm worried about is the supply chain issues, right? And, you know, Doris Matsui and I, one of my Democrat colleagues on the committee, and you mentioned this earlier in our comments, have introduced legislation that will help get Health and Human Services to try to map this pharmaceutical supply chain in the United States so that we have better data versus disjointed data from different agencies, try to get it in one place.
Right, because I understand right now no single federal agency has a full view.
That's correct,
right,
and that's what you want to do.
The entire U.S. drug supply chain start to finish, and that's a problem.
That's a problem, and that's what we want to try to do, is try to map that and then look for vulnerabilities. And, you know, the API production overseas is just one of the vulnerabilities. There's all kinds of other economic related issues. You know, there's multitude of reasons why we're drug. Let me just describe a couple of the reasons if I can. I don't want to get out ahead of you, but But for example, a number of years ago, my wife's an anesthesiologist. There's a medication called propofol. It looks like milk in a bottle. If you've ever had, right? It was short for a period of time. The reason was because the only manufacturer was in Europe. And one of the states in the United States was planning to potentially add that medication to their, death penalty medication, okay? Capital punishment. And the manufacturer in the country said, we will not send propofol to the United States if anyone is going to use our medication for capital punishment. So so not only is there, it potentially did, but they resolved the problem because the federal government had to say, well, you guys need to change your plans here because it's going to affect the entire, but that was because we had only limited manufacturing capability. So I'm using that as an extreme example of, there are the chronic issues, but occasionally there are things that hit in manufacturing for a variety of reasons. You know, we had the plant in India shut down with carboplatin, as we described, right? All of a sudden,
that was a quality issue?
It was a quality issue, and all of a sudden you have a worldwide shortage of a chemo drug. So, you described Adderall, which is being used for ADHD, right? The demand was unpredictably high. It has been because it was found by many physicians to be very effective. And all of a sudden, you have a bunch of people coming into the marketplace, and there's not enough manufacturing capability, not capacity. So those are just some of the reasons. Remember when we had a shortage of antibiotics for little kids that had ear infections?
Right.
Augmentin. Augmentin. It was actually not Augmentin, the generic version of it. Okay. That was because during COVID, not as many kids got ear infections. Okay, so when the manufacturer looked at this, predicting the future, they do projections years ahead of time what the demand might be. Of course, the demand was fairly low during COVID, but when we came out of COVID, all of a sudden the demand was high. But they had projected the amount that they would need, and it wasn't enough. So for temporarily, for economic reasons and manufacturing reasons, they were short. So it's a challenge.
How worried are you, though, about our dependence on countries like China, like India? I mean, right now, some 80% of the medicines Americans take every day are produced outside the U.S., again, with China and India being the biggest producers.
Yeah, I mean,
is this a national security problem?
As I mentioned, it isn't becoming a national security issue, and I think that, if you look at the situation, it's a difficult one to solve because you have to look at the economics of what it takes. If you want to keep drug prices low, and we've dropped drug prices in the generic space very, very low. The ones you see that are very, very expensive, or in general, are not in the generic space. 90% of the drugs we take in the United States are generics, roughly, and so it makes it difficult if you're going to produce large volumes of generic medications in the United States or other countries where the manufacturing costs are higher. So then you end up having them produced in countries where it's much lower. Well, that's a challenge for a number of reasons. Number one, quality-related issues. Can the FDA keep up and make sure that the manufacturing facilities are up to our standards? And many times they are not. And who controls the export of the active pharmaceutical ingredient? It can get tied up in geopolitical disputes like we've seen during COVID with the Chinese. So Not as much with India because they're a democracy and a like-minded country, but we did see with carboplatinum that there was a quality issue. But that's where you get into the question: well, how far ahead should the FDA look? How many people do we have on staff at the FDA to make sure that we can have them all around the world? They are around the world, but do we have enough people? Do we have enough funding to make sure that the quality is there, so even if it's not produced here, we don't have these shutdowns? So
does the MAPS Act address that?
I would hope, yeah. The MAPS Act, with Congresswoman Matsui, is hoping to have a map of all of this, okay, the supply chain in one place, Health and Human Services, and then have the experts, and I wouldn't count Congress in that in many cases, the experts that know what they're doing as it relates to supply chain, as it relates to distribution, as it relates to manufacturing. Everybody together, if you have the data that you understand where the vulnerabilities are, then maybe you can address those. So that's what we need to do.
Let's talk about the generic specifically, and you've highlighted how they have these issues, and in particular, what we need to do, I hear so many people say, is quality. We've got to, instead of having this race to the bottom on pricing, you've got to find a way to reward quality. What are your thoughts on that? How do we do that?
You have to, but it's a free market. It's a free market economy, so you have, and it's a difficult challenge, because of course, a large population of the American people are dependent on these medications, and there's various degrees of the ability of people to afford them, whether they have insurance coverage. The other thing is the cost to the federal government through the Medicaid program, now Medicare Part D, and other programs. Of course, from a federal government perspective, we want to try to keep the cost down. But when you get reimbursement issues related to whether it's physician practices or the cost of medications, and you drive the reimbursement down too low, then you get into a situation where you'll have generics that just are not economically feasible.
Well, I understand some generics will cost only, the average price is between $1 and $8. And there are some companies that actually lose money making them. So when people talk about raising quality, I'm hearing some experts say we need to raise the price, which I know is something, that there's a disconnect. We go, wait a minute, we're talking about lowering drug prices. Why would we want to raise them? Because I heard there's such a high cost to these low prices because the companies can't afford to improve, to address the issues that the FDA highlights.
Well, there's two separate problems here. The generic space and the branded space are completely different. Totally separate. They're both very complicated. And so, the problem is in many cases in the branded space, when you have innovative products that come to the marketplace and you look at sometimes decades of research and development, and the economic case is made that the price has to be what it has to be when it comes to the market, right? And that's driven by a multitude of things, not just the pharmaceutical company or the distributor. It's a whole supply chain situation. The generics is somewhat different because the R&D costs and everything have been realized for the most part. Now, experts in that area don't criticize me for saying that, but the reality is that has happened when they were non-generic. So now we have a place where we have medication that needs to be available, but we're not looking at really recouping R&D costs. You want to not lose money, but you want to. And so where does that balance get struck, right? And again, from a federal government perspective, Medicare, Medicaid, and other government programs that pay for these things, you want low prices. But I do think in the generic space, in some areas, that the prices have been driven low enough that it's made it difficult to make the economic case for why people should continue to make these medications and distribute them.
How feasible do you think it is to really onshore medicine production to the U.S.?
It's going to be very difficult. Mm-hmm. And the main is it's driven by economics. I mean, it's not driven by ideological reasons. It's just driven by the economics, as I talked about before. It just costs more to to manufacture certain things in the United States. And I'm not saying it shouldn't. That's not a judgment on wages or anything else, that in the United States. But that's just the facts. It's just more expensive to produce it here, or in some cases, European countries, and that's why they have outsourced the production to countries like China or Vietnam or other places. So it's difficult. It's not a simple solution to just say, well, why don't we just onshore all this? Or the other one is, why don't we just stockpile these? Why don't the federal government, things that are short, why don't we stockpile them? And it seems like a good short-term solution, but in the long run, the medicine's outdate. You don't know what the demand's going to be. The federal government could have warehouses full of stuff that goes bad, and you have to have a whole system to know which things outdate, and then you get rid of those, and where do they go, and then you got to bring in new ones. I mean, it's just not that simple. It's a complicated problem. I hope I get that across to everyone, that there's no one simple silver bullet here.
And with onshoring, too, isn't there the issue of our environmental laws? Because when it comes to making these APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, some of them produce very toxic waste, right? So we probably couldn't.
That's partially true, yeah. I mean, the manufacturing, whatever it takes to manufacture these, there are going to be issues related to, energy use, what's the energy demand for the manufacturing facility, and as you know, we're trying to do all we can to get carbon emissions down worldwide. The United States, by the way, is doing probably the best job in the world, but that's why I think it's a difficult problem to solve, because it's not only the overall manufacturing cost to produce these in the United States is not one thing. You brought up, we want to make sure whatever we do here in our country, we're not putting toxic chemicals into the Potomac River, right? I mean, and so we should be doing those things. But we also want to make sure that people that are making these, people that are working these factories, are getting paid well, right, and have good benefits and the things that we know that we value here in the United States. And to do that, it costs a lot more money.
So what about friendshoring or nearshoring as an option?
That is a good option. I'm a congressional co-chair of the study group on Japan for the former members of Congress organization, myself and Congresswoman Diana DeGette from Colorado. And her and I travel to Japan every year. That's a classic place, potentially, as a friend that we could, have. And they're worried about the same issue, by the way, because a lot of their stuff, not only the pharmaceutical space, but everywhere, comes from China, because it's really very close, right? But yeah, on friendshoring, I think, North America, friends like Japan, Australia, some European countries. I think all of us are trying to figure out how do we balance that and how do we make that happen.
How important is redundancy? Because we had that tornado in, I guess, 2023.
Two of them right in a row that hit Puerto Rico.
Right. Yeah. Well, there was a hurricane in Puerto Rico, and then the tornado in North Carolina.
Oh, the tornado, yeah.
Right. The plant, the pharmaceutical plant, that one single event put at risk drugs at hospitals you needed to block pain, sedate patients, and fight infections. So what do we do about redundancy?
Well, we need to work with the FDA and make sure that we can, for example, this is hypothetical. You have two manufacturing facilities. One of them has to shut down. The other manufacturing facility needs to have the latitude to, at least temporarily, produce more of a certain medication per day or per week, right? Above and beyond what they're certified by the FDA to produce. So there needs to be a little more flexibility there where you can ramp up. And that's one of the things coming out of COVID, as far as things like masks and all these other things, not just drugs, is that we need to have that kind of resiliency where if we need these things, we have the ability built in, with probably some federal support, built in, so that we can expand our capacity in the short run. And we may have to make sure all the federal agencies have the flexibility to allow that, and still, and still keep the quality there. And so resiliency within our own country is important, no doubt.
I mean, you mentioned federal support. Other countries, China, India, subsidize a lot of what their pharmaceutical companies do. We don't really have a level playing field, companies in the U.S.
Yeah, they also pay their workers pennies, to make the, in those countries, to make the products, right? And so, but there is, to your point, there's a multitude of reasons why it's more cheap to make these things in places like China. It's not just the wages, it's other things. Government subsidization, and some people have suggested here, I mentioned stockpiling earlier, right? And we have a free market economy. It's based on supply and demand and the free market. The way I look at it is, if there are places where the free market can't solve the problem, or voluntarily, then you have to start looking at things like where you subsidize things from a federal level. But as you might imagine, my feeling would be that's a potential snowballing financial problem that we could get ourselves into. And we have to
Haven't
look
we
closely
subsidized
at
other industries, oil and gas?
Of course we do. Oil and gas, renewables, that's just in the energy space. The federal government subsidizes everything. I mean, my local communities get their community development block grants to, fix things in their communities. The federal government is involved in that, absolutely. And I'm not saying that's not a reason to look at it. But we do in the tax space is an area we haven't really talked about, but we do have an opportunity there.
Okay.
To make sure that if companies are going to produce things in the United States, make sure that we're competitive, at a minimum, in the tax space. For example, whether the individuals that work at the companies or the companies themselves have a competitive tax climate and regulatory climate to work in. That is in a way subsidizing an industry, but it's complicated question.
I noticed there are some 10 measures on this topic that have been introduced in Congress, 10 bills to help deal with this, and maybe there are even more. Maybe I missed a few when I was counting.
Yeah.
So why do you think this is such a unifying issue in these divisive times? And what do you think the chances are that we will get a vote on one of these measures soon?
I think it's the reason it's not that. Actually, there's some disagreement between the political parties on how to solve the drug shortages, but they're very, very small. Doris Matsui and I, she's my Democrat colleague that I'm working with, we're in agreement. We need to do something about understanding our supply chain and look for vulnerabilities, right? But it's unifying because pharmaceuticals affect every citizen in our country, all the way from newborn babies, all the way to our grandparents or great-grandparents, right? And it's such a critical issue because it affects people's quality of life. It affects people's ability to live a quality life or extend their life. In the case of like carboplatin, you're short on that. How'd you like to have cancer? And your oncologist say, well, you're gonna get half the drug this week that you would have because it's short. That's a real story. My oncology friend told me that. So that's why it's very personal, and it should be. And so I think members of Congress on both sides take it that way and understand that it directly impacts everyone. And then if you look at the individual, that snowballs into how are we as a society, If you don't have a healthy populace, then you lose productivity. It affects everything, right? It just affects everyone, and that's why it's so personal.
We have some audience questions, or at least I think we have time for one that were sent in early. So Lisa, if you could read us the question.
We have one from Christine Lee from Friends of Cancer Research. Is finding balance between innovation, progression, and affordable drugs possible? If so, what does it require? And what can Congress do to actively support this balance?
That's just such a simple question. I don't know how to answer that. As we've talked during the talk, I'll just say this. It's a delicate balance. I take it this way a lot, is that there's a lot the federal government can do, like mapping the shortages and knowing where the deficits are, and then working with the industry to solve those problems, right? But I also don't. I'm just giving my own personal view. But I also don't see, for example, some people have suggested that the federal government manufacture medications ourselves, right? That doesn't solve your problem. And again, you get into the stockpiling issue and the challenges there. So I think that the thing that Congress can do is help show everyone the data, get that message to the American people, and then work with everybody all along the pharmaceutical supply chain to try to solve some of these problems as it relates to the deficits that we would identify in the supply chain. Again, it seems like it would just be, well, why don't we just, every medication, why don't we just subsidize the cost for everyone? And the reality is that when you at the end of the day, I just don't see that solving the problem. It makes it probably maybe even a little bit worse, because it's a short-term solution for really a decades and decades long problem. We started having this problem many, many years ago. But the one thing I will say, it is a unifying problem for Congress. We do have some differences in views on our committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee. But for the most part, everybody is working towards the same goal. The American people should know that. We're working towards the same goal of trying to be helpful where we can be, but also working closely with the private sector from top to bottom to try to solve this problem.
I'm Indiana Congressman Dr. Larry Bucshon.
Thank
you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.